What is your name, what are your pronouns, and what are you going to talk about today?
My name is Rich Turner and I am he/him. And today I'm going to talk about being Cantonese.
Could you explain what it means to be Cantonese?
My family, my heritage is from Hong Kong, and indeed I lived there as a small child. I think saying Cantonese or Hong Kong is actually important because it will often get sort of mixed into being Chinese, which of course does form part of my heritage and background, but at the same time trying to define it as something different. And of course, the political situation in Hong Kong, a lot of people are living that sort of experience right now and defining who and what being Cantonese is versus what it means to be Chinese.
Could you please give us a brief description of what being Cantonese means to you personally?
It's a huge part of me. It's my heritage. It's my family. The bulk of my family live in Hong Kong. As a kid, I could speak Cantonese, though I confess I've forgotten most of it now and can only speak most things mostly related to food. But even language was a big part of it. My mum was an amazing Cantonese chef. She worked in Chinatown in Birmingham. And so a lot of my childhood was spent with the Cantonese community. On weekends, we'd go and visit Cantonese friends, and we were all our own group, and we would hang around together. And so it forms a really big part of my growing up and my identity and who I am. It forms such a part of my family identity, and even with my daughter, who's I guess one removed, if you like, from that heritage, which I try and keep that alive for her. So we'll often celebrate Chinese New Year together, for instance, and make sure we make a big thing of that. And we'll visit Hong Kong as often as we can, and COVID sadly formed a big barrier there, and that was quite sad. It kind of removed me and my daughter sort of one step away from that family history.
How did being Cantonese affect you growing up?
On a number of fronts, I think. So I obviously talked about diet, but actually that's a really important concept. So a lot of people, when people think of dim sum, they think of sort of dumpling-based foods. They think of it as a cuisine, but actually it's much more of a cultural phenomenon. It's much more an opportunity for friends and family to get round the table. And if you consider it, there's an act of sharing going on, so you're sharing all of the same dishes. So it's much more than just a cuisine. It's an entire sort of experience. And that concept of the family, of togetherness, all stems from those types of experiences together. I think even my education was influenced by being Cantonese. There was a strong family drive to be quite academic, to do well in your exams, go to university and so on. I'm not sure I would have ever been allowed to pursue a sort of vocational interest. I'm not sure my family would have entertained that too much. I think the reason, in fact, that my mum and dad moved from Hong Kong to the UK was for my education. I never had the chance to ask them, but I know they moved the year before my birth, and I suspect that formed a big part of it. And I think increasingly as I got older, understanding the sort of political dynamics at play in Hong Kong, I became much more aware of that. But even that side of my sort of background, I became more involved in, and my family would be more vocal about. So yeah, honestly, it sort of touched every single part of my upbringing.
Have you felt you've been marginalised or stereotyped due to being Cantonese?
Yeah, actually, and it is quite subtle at times. As a community, we aren't particularly vocal, right? So if you are ever marginalised anyway, you sort of tend to just keep your head down and carry on. So there are sort of openly overt, comments that can come out, and that has happened before. Largely ignorantly, I feel, never because of malice. A few times I've challenged people. But even, I was at a parents' evening last week, I think it was. It was sort of jokingly remarked that my daughter's academic performance or mindset, it was like, because of that Chinese background, she's working hard. And in the time, I remember at the time, I kind of looked sideways like, okay, it's a bit odd. And it was only really afterwards I sort of reflected on, well, probably not really the case. She's hardworking because she's hardworking. And if there is any influence at play, it's probably more that I'm from the south of England, where actually it's normal to do that amount of homework. And the fact that she happens to have Cantonese heritage, it's kind of neither here or there. But it was done in a kind of mocking way. And it was really odd in the moment. I didn't challenge it in the moment or anything. And it was only afterwards I thought, what a really bizarre thing to have remarked on in a parents' evening. So this is what I mean. It tends to be subtle. And I think probably one of the biggest things of all is the failure to sort of understand Hong Kong and Cantonese people as their own sort of identity. It will often bleed into being Chinese. And at this point in time in history, in political history, actually, that's a really important distinction to be made. And, I have family members on the streets of Hong Kong, fighting for their identity and fighting for their political rights. So just simply being sort of led into being Chinese isn't that useful in airing some of those concerns. It just kind of gets lost, which when you think about it is sad. The fact that you have an entire population of people, an entire history, quite literally fighting for their identity simply because they kind of get lumped in with just being Chinese is all sort of the same. Incidentally, I should also add that being Chinese means very different things depending on which area of China you're from. It's a huge country, and actually your culture, history, and so on can be massive. Even your diet can be massively different, and that failure to distinguish between that, I think, it's not like overt marginalization or anything, but it sort of dampens the experience and the meaning, if that makes sense. It dampens the meaning of being Cantonese. There would have been a time in my life that if someone asked, I'd say, I'm Chinese. And it's only really in adulthood, as I've got closer and closer to the politics of Hong Kong, do I now say, no, I'm from Hong Kong. Do you think it's a really important distinction to be made? I remember it was a few years ago now, me and a few friends went to get a takeaway. And I remember pulling up in front of a Chinese takeaway. And one of the people in the car, I was sat in the passenger seat, the takeaway was beside me. He said, oh, the chink is just over there. And I remember being sat there, and I remember sort of going, I was thinking, has that been said deliberately as a kind of quippy remark? But again, it was pure ignorance, right? So it wasn't done out of malice. It's just this individual had just called Chinese takeaways chinkis for, their family members had been doing it and just had no real concept of why that might be seen as offensive. It's a friend, so I was clearly dealt with it in a constructive kind of way. But it was a really good example of that sort of no one trying to be malicious. It's just sometimes coming out of ignorance and not knowing. And I think it's why I think the human library is really important. So you can tell those sort of stories and appreciate individuals.
Has anything like this happened at the university, or have you felt quite accepted?
I think I see great efforts from the university to be inclusive and to treat people as individuals. So thankfully, no, I've never really experienced like that. In the area, in the region, definitely, yes. And I suspect that is probably the common experience, that actually on campus it's a very safe environment and a very inclusive environment, but you take 10 steps outside of the campus and it probably feels less that way. And in truth, it won't be, that's not a University of Hull specific thing. I suspect there are places all over the world where actually you feel very safe in one part, but then you go and step outside in the community, it can feel very different. But I am very thankful that the university strives so hard in pursuit of inclusivity. I think the Canto and Chinese communities tend to be fairly quiet, actually, don't tend to be fairly vocal. And my suspicion is there's lots of stuff that goes on, lots of marginalization that goes on, but it doesn't often get talked about. And my suspicion is it's not because it's not happening. My suspicion is it's just because actually the community tends to keep its head down and just get on with it.
Could you do some myth busting about stereotypes surrounding being Cantonese?
I think the big one probably is actually understanding Hong Kong as its as its own identity and trying to differentiate it from simply being Chinese. I think that's probably the main one. I think trying to understand the politics of Hong Kong at the moment, I guess that the sort of myth would be that actually all's fine and well for the Cantonese community. The truth is it probably isn't. And, if you have a Cantonese friend, for instance, living in the UK, it could well be that their family members are going through a tough time at the moment. It could well be that their family members are moving away from Hong Kong, moving out of their homes. And when you think about that concept that people are leaving their homes, quite literally really to run away. When you think about that concept, that's like quite a terrible thing to happen. And so I guess the main myth to be broken is all's fine and well. You probably see your Cantonese friend and behind the scenes, I imagine their families are going through a little bit of a tough time and that can be quite a traumatic experience. People have been detained and they may well have a family member who's been through that. And I think that's probably the main myth. So I guess one stereotype is people of Asian descent being sort of more academically focused than necessarily vocational. Even within the community, we joke about that. So that comes up. I've got some Cantonese friends locally, and if I send my children to sports, for example, they're like, "Oh, how dare you? How dare you send them to sports?" So even as a community, we are self-aware of that stereotype. In some ways, it holds true, and I think one of the reasons for that is 40 years ago, you would have had huge populations, both in Hong Kong and in China, actually, that were incredibly poor. My family lived in some of the worst slums of Hong Kong 2 generations ago, and I actually had to work quite hard to get out of that. And of course, part of that act of working hard was working hard at school, was working hard at university, and so on. So I do think there's a sort of economic and historical driver behind some of these stereotypes. I think what we probably need to now recognise, actually, upbringings, career choices nowadays can be very different, and there are so many more doors than there were before. So I think it's about being aware of that stereotype and not simply jumping to it, and sort of recognising that actually in 21st century Britain in particular, there are a lot of avenues open, and just because someone has that heritage doesn't mean they're going to fall into that pigeonhole. Their choices are far greater than someone's choice 20 years ago, and we need to recognise that.
How can the people around you and the university do better?
It's about understanding the Cantonese community's culture, history, understanding the political tensions at play at the moment and how that might be affecting individuals and families. It's also about recognising actually how that could play out in discussion and debate. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that you end up in a kind of political debate between someone who's Cantonese and someone who's Chinese. And it's about understanding that debate is real. But I think the biggest bit of advice I can give anyone is to enjoy Cantonese culture and heritage. Actually, it is to be enjoyed, and it's so rich and beautiful. And one of the quirks of Hong Kong is it has been through various different stages of history, and there are so many different international influences at play. And it's kind of created this tapestry of West, East, of new, old, of high technology and traditional ways of living. There's this really lovely kind of tapestry that goes on. And honestly, it's to be enjoyed. And I think if anyone's, was wondering, what can they do better? I'd just say go and enjoy it. Go and enjoy Chinese New Year and see what that's all about. Go and enjoy some of the food. Ask for the traditional menu, not the British menu. Go and sample some of that, and bring your family to dim sum. Engage in the act of kind of sharing food with one another and ordering with one another, and just enjoy it and take an interest in it. I think that's probably the most that anyone can do. I think probably the main thing as an institution that we can do is recognise that the experience of our students isn't just within the confines of the campus, and understanding that experience from start to finish, and working with the locality to create an inclusive environment, not just on campus but within the area as well. I guess what we don't see much of, the visibility, I guess, of those communities tends to be quite hidden. I mean, I'm a staff member, but if I was a student member here, I'm not sure where I'd turn to actually to find people like me. I'd probably fall upon it by accident. So maybe that kind of signposting and visibility. I know Husu obviously do a lot of work on raising the visibility of societies and groups and so on. But as I say, unless you were really kind of actively looking, you're more likely to fall upon it by accident.
How do you feel the media represents being Cantonese?
In terms of mainstream news outlets, the political situation in both Hong Kong and China does get a lot more airtime than it used to, although it's still relatively low, really, in the scheme of things. And I guess the slight irony to that is, it would have been, a year ago now, I think, where the government allowed essentially dual passports. They opened a window for people to apply for dual passports. So we are seeing this kind of influx of Cantonese, but probably a low awareness of the communities that are moving into as to why that's happening, and why all of a sudden are my rent prices increasing. Well, it's increasing because actually there's this influx going on, and that's happening because of a political situation in Hong Kong. So it receives airtime, but probably not the amount it deserves or needs in order for the communities to understand really what's going on. Oh, look, Hong Kong has had I guess, quite a fabulous relationship with Western film media, whether it's Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, and so on. I think there's a fondness, if nothing else, that kind of happens there. I think one thing that is happening is you're seeing a greater emphasis Western filmmakers to incorporate mainland Chinese audiences, recognizing, of course, it's a big market. I think the danger of that is it ends up glossing over some of the kind of political tensions at play. So that's the only thing I would say. So I think there is a fondness of Hong Kong. It's ultimately why it's a big tourist destination. It does have a very lovely sort of history and interaction with Western media, and there are some icons, Bruce Lee, for instance, that stand out. But at the same time, I think modern media doesn't tackle those situations. And when you think of the human stories that must go on, where you have people on the street fighting, where people are being unnecessarily detained and so on, that's not really tackled in mainstream media.
Is there anything else you would like to say, or anything you would like anyone to know about being Cantonese?
No, like I say, just enjoy it. It's such a kind of rich topic and culture to get engaged in, and an open one at that as well, right? So it's accessible. So I would just encourage people to go and learn and enjoy it, and as I say, visit traditional Cantonese restaurants, take the family, just go and enjoy it.